Avinu Shebashamayim, Sur Yisrael v'Goalo, Barechet Medinat Yisrael Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, Hagen Aleh B'avrat Chastecha, Ufros Aleh Sukat Shalomecha, Ushlach Archa V'Amidcha L'Rasheha Sareha V'Yoatzeha, V'Taknem Be'etzah Tova Milefanecha, Chazek Et Midei B'Ginei Eretz Kodshenu, Anchilem Eloheinu Yeshua, V'Ateret Tzitzachon Te'aterem, V'Nat Hata Shalom Ba'aretz, V'Simchat Olam Liyosheveha. V'Etachenu Kol Beit Yisrael P'Godna B'Chol Atzot V'Zureihem, V'Tolechem Meherok Kamamiyot L'Tzion Yirecha, V'Li Yerushalayim Mishkan Shemecha, Ka'Katuv B'Torat Moshe Avdecha, Im Yihiyeh Nidachacha B'Ktzei HaShamayim, Misham Yikapetzcha Adonai Elohecha Misham Yikachecha. V'Haviecha Adonai Elohecha El Haaretz Asher Yarshu Avotecha V'Rishta, V'Hitivecha V'Hirbecha Mi'avotecha. V'Yachei Levavenu Li'ahava Li'yira Et Shemecha, Lishmar Kol Divrei Toratecha. Ushlach lanu Mehera ben David Mashiach Tzidkecha, Lifdot Mechakei Ketz Yeshuatecha. Hafa Bahadar Ga'onu Zecha, Al Kol Yoshevei Tevel Artzecha V'Yamar Kol Asher Neshama V'Yapo, Adonai Elohei Yisrael Melech Machuto B'Chol Mashallah, Amen Selah. Our Heavenly Father, Israel's Rock and Redeemer, bless the state of Israel, the first flowering of our redemption. Shield it under the wings of your loving kindness, and spread over it the tabernacle of your peace. Send your light and truth to its leaders, ministers, and officials, and direct them with good counsel before you. Strengthen the hands of the defenders of our holy land. Grant them deliverance, our God, and crown them with the crown of victory. Grant peace in the land and everlasting joy to its inhabitants. As for our brothers, the whole house of Israel, remember them in all the lands of their dispersion, and swiftly lead them upright to Zion, your city, and Jerusalem, your dwelling place. As it is written in the Torah of Moses, your servant, even if you are scattered to the furthermost lands under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and take you back. The Lord your God will bring you to your land, your ancestors possessed, and you will possess it. And he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. Unite our hearts to love and revere your name and observe all the words of your Torah. And swiftly send us your righteous anointed one of the house of David to redeem those who long for your salvation. Appear in your glorious majesty over all the dwellers on earth, and let all who breathe declare, the Lord God of Israel is king, and his kingdom has dominion over all. Let us all say together, Amen, Selah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning, and welcome. I am Danny Nave, President and CEO of Israel Bonds. These are devastating times for Israel since the terrible atrocities began on that dark Saturday. After the attacks, a very high number of people needed an immediate medical attention. Most of them were rushed to Soroka Medical Center. Soroka is just 25 miles from the Gaza Strip and is one of Israel's leading hospitals and a major medical center in southern Israel. I can tell you from my own past experience as former Israel Minister of Health, Soroka is also one of Israel's best medical centers. Following this horrible assault against innocent Israeli civilians, medical attention was imperative. If it were not for Soroka and its staff, we cannot imagine the outcome. And we are grateful to all involved, from the doctors, nurses, and administrative staff at the hospital. Thanks to all of them, many Israeli lives were saved. And it is an honor to have this morning Dr. Shlomi Codish, Director General of Soroka Medical Center, here today to give us a breakdown of what happened and why Soroka is so important at this time. We know that this special briefing with Dr. Codish will be informative and enlightening to all of us. Before we introduce Dr. Codish, please welcome Dr. Andrew Hatter, who is a board-certified orthopedic surgeon, as well as the current Vice Chairman of the National and International Board of Israel Bonds. He also co-chairs the Israel Bonds Medical Division. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Hatter.
Thank you, Donnie. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here for this important briefing. I would like to thank our entire Israel Bond staff for their efforts in getting this meeting set up so quickly, and to the approximately 500 people who are participating today. We have said many times that we are in uncharted territory. The vicious, unprovoked attack on Israel and its citizens by Hamas was a massacre like never before. We are grateful for the emergency response we saw from the civilians who brought in wounded to the medical staff at Soroka Medical Center. The medical personnel and doctors responded and were fast on their feet. They helped to tend to hundreds of wounded and saved many lives during these inconceivable times. By whatever means necessary, from the civilians in their cars who helped bring in the wounded, many of whom were in critical condition, to those being airlifted by helicopter to the hospital, so many people played an important part in saving lives in Israel. As many of you know, we were supposed to be in Israel today on our 7th Israel Bond medical mission. On one of our previous missions, we visited Soroka University Medical Center and saw how they were set up to deal with trauma and terrorism from rocket fire, but certainly nothing like they're dealing with today. We met with doctors and staff that treated many of the victims of prior attacks. On our first medical mission in 2009, we went to Barzilai Hospital in Ashkelon, which was severely damaged by the current attacks. At the helm of Soroka University Medical Center is Dr. Shlomi Codish, the director who helped patients at their darkest hours. His staff worked on treating injuries to everyone that was brought in, from wounded children to the elderly. Thank you for being here, and please let us welcome Dr. Shlomi Codish, Director General of Soroka University Medical Center.
So thank you very much for inviting me. These are indeed very trying times. And what I will try to do, and I will not really show a presentation so much as use it as a visual aid, a very brief description of what Soroka Medical Center is. If you could please advance a slide. So we're the only medical center who has a level 1 trauma center in all of Southern Israel, caring for over 1 million people and about 60% of the land area of the country. If we could please move one more slide. And as you can see, the Gaza Strip is here to the west, and we care for the entire area that was under attack. Saturday of Simchat Torah, and the following days. And let's move on to the next slide. And I would like us all, before I proceed, to be silent for a few moments in memory of our fallen comrades at the hospital. And as a way of describing what happened that day, I will use the illustration of Dr. Eitan Ne'eman, of blessed memory. Dr. Eitan Ne'eman is the doctor standing here on the right, treating one of the first casualties of that horrible Shabbat, a Bedouin child, 8 years old, who had a gunshot wound from terrorists to his abdomen. Eitan was a specialist in pediatric intensive care who cared for patients the entire day. At around noon, he was called up for reserve service. And despite us being able to discharge him, he went off to the army. If we could please advance the slide. A passing by journalist photographed him davening on the side of the road, the photo on the right, and he was killed in action the next day as a physician on the front line. Another example, please advance the slide. Dr. Daniel Levy, a resident in ENT, in ear, nose, and throat, an Ole Hadash from Peru, who came alone to Israel, married, started a family with 2 children, living in Be'eri. When gunfire started out, he left his family, his wife, Lihi, and their 2 young children in a bomb shelter in their home in Be'eri, and ran to the clinic under gunshots all around him to treat whatever wounded patients would come into the clinic. What came into the clinic were Hamas terrorists who shot everyone in the clinic, knowing full well that this was a clinic. This was a medical facility where people come to save lives. We know they knew because we found the maps where the clinic was clearly marked as a clinic. Thankfully, as is not always the case for other people, his wife and children survived this attack within the bomb shelter in their home. If we could please advance another slide. So a bit of what a medical center looks like under such an event. So we train for mass casualty events, and every medical center in the world trains for mass casualty events. Other countries it might be earthquakes or significant car accidents. In Israel, it's often terror attacks. The most extreme scenario that the government trains us for is for 300 casualties to be brought in. And at 300 casualties, Soroka is expected or is considered to be saturated or at capacity. Shabbat morning, I got a phone call at 6:40 a.m. saying there are bomb sirens, air raid sirens going off in Beersheba. And we made a very rapid decision to start moving wards from unprotected sites to protected sites. Again, regretfully, this is something we're very prepared for. But at 7:45, when my entire staff was already at the hospital, we decided to announce a mass casualty event. We realized this was both a Shabbat and a Chag. It was following Sukkot. Many people were abroad. It was unclear what kind of response we could mount. And we issued an all-hands alert, basically requesting everyone in the hospital to show up. Understanding that people are expected now to travel through air raid sirens to the hospital, potentially risking their lives along the way, to be ready for what might come. And at 9 a.m., we had 100 people in the hospital. And I don't know how clear the photos are, but these are just, photos of our trauma unit and our emergency room in the early hours. And I hope it's clear we were not short for people to treat at any point. We had enough physicians, nurses, and so on. The shortages were equipment, a CT scanner, operating theaters, and those required significant triage. At some point, I guess we'll do a several-hour discussion of the actual managing of such an event, because there's no protocols. There's no protocols to the situation where your ED has 100 people with gunshot wounds who require surgery in 10 operating theaters, and what type of triage you do. I'll say, and I'm extremely proud of my staff for being able to do this, absolutely every single patient who needed life-saving surgery received it on time. And we were able to perform a very, very careful and close triage. Patients were coming in ambulances, in helicopters, in private vehicles, every conceivable way people were able to make it. And if you can advance to the next slide, and I apologize for the next slide. Stretchers were being dropped in every corner of the emergency department. When people ran back to the field without stretchers to bring new patients in, there was no time to wait for patients to be moved. Our helicopter pad worked nonstop for basically 24 hours, flying patients in from every corner of the Negev. The entire IDF and all civilian helicopters were recruited for this effort. And if we can move on to the next slide. And again, I'm being relatively brief. Believe me, each one of these slides would be, a horrible event in and of itself. One of the most terrifying events during the day was the phone calls we kept getting in from friends, family, relatives who live in the Negev saying, "Have you seen my son? Have you seen my daughter?" A lot of people were being brought in, rushed in, unconscious, several gunshot wounds to the torso, to the limbs, without any identification on them. And we treated over 100 patients initially as anonymous patients, to great devastation to families, including many killed patients or killed casualties. And what you see in this photo is our response to that. We had volunteer medical students who were comparing photos people mailed in saying, this is a photo of my brother, have you seen him? And photos we took in hospital of all anonymous patients and bodies, trying to manually identify the photos as rapidly as possible to give some kind of relief to families along the way. This was a side effort at saving, actual critically wounded patients. This took place over 48 hours. I will share one terrible story with you in which a family identified their son, a positive identification that showed his ID, which matched the look of the patient. And they sat next to him in intensive care, an unconscious patient, for 2 days, when another family claimed that patient as their child, and they were correct. We were able to identify them using fingerprints and DNA that were available to, let's call him patient number 2. He woke up 2 days later and gave his name. And probably one of my most difficult moments was seeing the reaction of, family number 1 here, who basically were thrown into a terrible uncertainty. The body of their child was identified 2 days later. And possibly as a testament to the dedication of the team at our intensive care unit, the mother, immediately following the identification of her son as dead, called the head of the unit and thanked them for the care they provided someone else's child during that period of time. And again, this really is only one instance of hundreds of horrifying stories we've all been exposed to during this Shabbat. You can move on to the next slide, please. So how does a hospital prepare? How does a tertiary medical center prepare? So there's preparations you do early in the morning. Moving wards to protected sites. We still have many sites in the hospitals that are not protected from rocket attacks. So we need to move them because we can't expose patients to the possibility of a rocket hitting the hospital, as has happened in many hospitals in Israel. Seeing the horrible irony of press reporting hospitals being attacked by Hamas in Gaza, and I apologize if this sounds politically incorrect, they have a lot of practice attacking hospitals. And we prepare for the event of our hospital being attacked by moving many wards and facilities, including critical life-saving facilities. The other things we did on Shabbat, we opened a new intensive care unit, a new surgical ward. We're now opening a new rehabilitation ward because the sheer numbers are simply beyond our regular capabilities. And as a testament to the capabilities of the Israeli public sector, and I know there's been a lot of criticism, but we're a public hospital, and we've been able to add capacity with a lot of help from friends abroad, funds, support, volunteers, and so on. But we've been able to now be better prepared for a ground incursion into Gaza through the steps on this slide than we were last Shabbat. And last Shabbat, we were tested in significant fire. If we can please move on to the next slide. So these are the numbers. Numbers really can't describe the horror, but if there are medical professionals in the crowd, I'm sure you'll understand what the meanings are of 680 patients flowing into one emergency department during 12 hours, 150 of them, a little less, 130, treated in the trauma unit, over 200 blood units, over 100 emergency surgeries performed in the first 5 hours. These are really numbers that are beyond what most medical centers in the world can handle. As a result, we evacuated that night 80 patients out of our hospital. We've never done this before. We've never done what is called secondary evacuation. We had 20 ambulances, 2 buses, 3 Black Hawk helicopters, and 2 C-53 helicopters, airlift, car lift, and every other possible option. Patients out of this hospital to hospitals as far north as Ziv, in order to make room for further casualties. The next day, we had 50 patients come in because there were still terrorists around the Negev shooting up, laying in wait. 50 patients is a large mass casualty event. And ironically, we felt that it wasn't a challenge at all because the previous day had seen this tremendous event. We can't afford as a society, as a Jewish people, as a Western world, for us to be complacent to the option that says, 50 patients, that's easy. It isn't. It's 50 human tragedies. It's atrocities beyond imagination. And it happened in the Negev now, but it will happen elsewhere if this isn't curbed. Can we move on, please? These are just, I don't know if this is visible on smaller screens. I don't see it here. These are just the numbers of, who arrived at what Israeli hospitals during that day, or sorry, the days following. The sheer numbers arriving at Soroka and at Barzilai. Barzilai had the additional challenge of dead bodies delivered to its ED. We received far fewer dead bodies to care for here, or not to care for, to deal with here. If we can move on, please. And also because first responders in Israel, and thank you for the introduction where you said we prepare all the time. So the red piece, this is the number of patients by severity sent to different hospitals in Israel, and we're on the far right. And what you can see is the red block, which is the critically wounded patients, were by large all sent to Soroka. That's our role. This is our destination. It's what we do for Israeli society. And first responders were fairly good at saying, we're going to identify the critically wounded patients, send them to Soroka where facilities are more advanced, and we're just bigger. We're better prepared to deal with these types of events. There's another circle that is not, so I'm going to stop here discussing wounded patients. I could tell you about young girls in pajamas with chest shots inflicted on them in their sleep. One of our first casualties was a woman who was a pregnant woman, shot in her abdomen, killing her an unborn baby. She will be okay. Ironically, again, a Bedouin patient. We're all citizens of the South in the country. I want to discuss our staff. Soroka has 5,300 employees. If we can move on to the next slide, please. All of whom, every single one of them, knows someone who died on Shabbat. Many of us, multiple people, be it on the staff, first-degree relatives of colleagues or colleagues, as I started with. We're all fighting for our homes. When I drove to the hospital on Shabbat in the morning, there were 3 A-raid sirens going off as I drove. Instructions are park your car on the side, get as far away from it as possible and lie down and wait 10 minutes. I don't think any one of our employees coming in that morning did that. We just drove through because we knew people depended on us. If anyone here knows my wife, don't tell her. I have a blanket in my car in case I have to lay down on the ground. But again, we have a staff that is totally dedicated to what we need to do. And except for people living in Otef Aza, in the area that simply couldn't leave their houses physically, people showed up. People came from the north who were on vacation. Took them 2 hours, but they drove south through A-raid sirens and through areas that were not cleared by the army. And as far as they knew, there were ambushes of Hamas terrorists in areas they drove through. And we're starting to realize, well, we realized the first day, but we still don't really have the time to treat them the way they deserve. And we will have months of treatment we need to do to deal with people who saw the sights of that Shabbat. Hundreds of people who saw Israeli elite soldiers, the elite units of the Israeli IDF who were called, who were shot with anti-tank missiles in ambushes set up by Hamas, who expected them to be coming and the routes they would be taking in. One of the things we do is we try to make sure our staff feels safe. So these are examples of activities for staff workers. We now have 300 children every day receiving daycare in the hospital. If you're a young social worker and your husband has been called up for reserve, as 200 of our staff has been called up, you're not going to come in and do your work if you don't have somewhere to leave your children that you feel safe with. So our bomb shelters in the hospital are used, and this is just one tiny example of what we do to try to help our staff cope with this. If we can move on to the next slide. To sort of wrap up a few items we've been dealing with staff wellness also deals with the fact that 20% of our staff are Muslim. The Negev is a very diverse population. We have many Bedouin populations in the population who were attacked as viciously as Jews when Hamas terrorists encountered them. And there is strife to a small extent, but it could increase and be a problem. We spend a lot of our time trying to make sure this does not become a significant problem. Volunteers and contribution, and I thank everyone here who was involved in support. The support of the Jewish world has been tremendous. It has an enormous effect on our preparedness. Soroka has enormous costs involved in preparing for the next steps. The government has a lot of work on its hands and is helping, but every help we get helps us prepare better, be it equipment and be it smaller expenses such as preparing new wards. So I really thank you for all of that. I don't think there's a Jewish doctor who hasn't offered to volunteer. We're limiting ourselves currently to Hebrew speakers. Sorry, it just makes more sense. I hope we don't reach the point where we need volunteers who can't speak to the patients. We started preparing for rehabilitation. Everyone who was treated and survived on Shabbat from critical wounds will need rehabilitation. The country is not prepared for rehabilitation of this number of people. And we already are furnishing, with the help of our friends in the world, a new 40-bed rehabilitation ward to allow for the best possible rehabilitation of these patients. And one word I want to say is day 2 and day 3 of the war, each one of them saw a Hamas terrorist being brought into Soroka. And this creates an enormous challenge, because I truly believe we are not Hamas terrorists. We have values that are above anything they might have inflicted. But treating Hamas terrorists in an area, in a hospital that is also treating 1,000 injured, innocent children, women, civilians, and elderly patients, is really a significant burden. We treated them, we stabilized them, and with coordination with the Ministry of Health, they were sent to hospitals elsewhere, where the impossible connection between, the casualties of this horrible event and Hamas terrorists will be removed. No Israeli hospital, despite what anyone might say. Oh, and there's an air raid siren going off. Is this us, do you think?
Yeah.
Oh, so I'm going to have to get off because we have an air raid siren going off. Sorry. You can proceed without me. Sorry, I have 1 minute to evacuate. Bye.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Codish. Obviously, you can see how things change immediately. Hopefully, he will be back and we can have some time for some Q&A. I don't see how anybody here could not be moved by what he told us. I began my career in a level 1 trauma center, and after listening to him, our worst day was probably an amateur hour compared to what they are going through. As I said, our group was there a couple of years ago, and right when we left, there was an air raid siren and they shut down the whole hospital. But again, that was nothing like they are going through. We'll give a few minutes to see if Dr. Codish does come back, so that we can ask him some questions. But I want you to all take a minute and reflect on what you've heard today. Many of you have asked how you can help Israel during this time, and we are here because of Israel Bonds, and that is the quickest and most effective way to get money and support to the state of Israel. And again, it's not a donation, it's an investment. And as our CEO, Donnie Nevert, alluded to, we have Shalom Bonds, which is a donation. And Soroka Medical Center has a Friends of the Soroka Medical Center in the US that you can make a Shalom Bond donation to. They will get the money in a year or 2 years at most, depending on the Shalom Bond. They will get the money that you invest plus interest. So this allows, as we call it, a double mitzvah. Israel will get this money immediately, and the medical center will then get the money within a year, but they will know that they're getting this money so they can allocate that now. So it's not a complete delay. I think it's very important that we all support Israel. We have normally raised $1 billion in Israel bonds every year for the last many years. We got an increase of $250 million last week, which we sold out immediately. And we now got an additional $750 million. So I see that Dr. Codish is back. I'm glad you're safe, sir. As I said to the group, I began my career in a level 1 trauma center. And I think on our worst day, it was an amateur hour compared to your light days. So I want to thank you for your insightful briefing into this situation from the medical standpoint. As a doctor, you are on the front lines of helping the wounded at a hospital that is close to where the attacks occurred. You have been there since the first day, guiding your staff to help treat the wounded and save lives. We are all grateful for all you and your entire staff have done to continue to save the lives of Israelis caught in the crossfire. And we are also appreciative of the information that you gave us today. We know it cannot be easy, but you and your staff have helped countless lives, and this is what is most important. At this time, if you have a few minutes, we would like to ask you a few questions, and I would like to introduce my co-chairman of the medical division from Chicago, Dr. Burton Herbstman, with the first question.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Donnie, for all you do. Thank you, Dr. Codish. I come to you from Chicago, where our strong community gives you 100% support now and forever, Dr. Codish. Israel, unfortunately, is experienced with wars, violence, and terrorist attacks. Not long ago, our Israel Bonds medical mission visited Soroka Medical Center and learned how you were set up to deal with trauma and rocket attacks. However, last week's attacks were completely unprecedented. The country has never seen this level of violence against civilians, and atrocities like this before. Soroka Medical Center received the majority of the people injured in those attacks. Have the injuries been different from what your hospital has experienced before? And what has this been like for your staff?
So beyond the magnitude of patients, there were two more factors that made this so much more difficult than previous events. One is the rate at which patients arrived. This was a nonstop arrival of dozens of patients at any given moment. Usually you have some time to stop and think, regroup, figure out what you're going to do next, what the next sort of step was going to be. And I actually pulled people who were part of my management team from treating patients at given points in time, and I said, it's more important that we figure out what we're doing in the next hour than treat another patient. Someone else will treat the patient. It's not that the patient wouldn't be treated. And falling back on protocols, even if the magnitude is different, but you have a protocol of how your brain works, how you think, how you process these events, was a huge element in the way we prepared for all of this. Also realizing that we don't have instructions from outside. The country was busy saving lives in the field. This was not a situation we were going to get, any help elsewhere. And the types of injuries, also a horrifying element of this. In most events, you see shrapnel injuries, rockets landing. Those are horrible on their own. But shrapnel injuries and soldiers who are usually protected, the torso has, bulletproof vests, the necks are protected, and so on. But seeing children with gunshot wounds in unprotected areas, and not one, in criminal events, you see one gunshot wound. Seeing young people with gunshot wounds, various organs, these were horrifying events, creating much more significant trauma and need for more operating rooms and other things I described. And as far as the staff goes, I think we're still running on adrenaline and endorphins and whatever else the pharmacologist will say is working coffee, a lot of coffee. But there will be a very long healing process here. There's absolutely no doubt, including the management team. This is something we'll have to turn to and deal with as we go along. We do have our mental health team working on early interventions for staff in the wards, simply because there are steps you need to do in the first phase. We're not unlike any army unit, in my point of view, who needs to deal with, being under attack in war.
Thank you, Dr. Codish, for that. At this point in time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Zev Shulkin from Dallas, Texas, who is our Associate Medical Chairman, for the next question.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderful, wonderful talk. Very, very moving, and quite shocking in a lot of ways. You've talked about your emergency response, and if you can emphasize what your plans are. You kind of alluded to the future and what's coming, and obviously there's a lot of unknown. So can you talk about plans, contingency plans for the coming weeks, what we might expect, and obviously what we can do as American physicians and American healthcare professionals to help?
So it's interesting because people who don't manage emergency events or aren't on the front lines of this might think that we're now in a period of rest, or in between. But we've been using every possible minute now trying to come up with scenarios that we need to be prepared for. Earlier today, a group of people organized for a sandbox drill of what we would do if a rocket hit different buildings in the hospital, what kind of response we would mount. We have a group of people whose job is to be first responders for the hospital in case of a massive rocket attack on Beersheba where EMS will not be available. So we retrained them today. So we're really spending a lot of time coming up with doomsday scenarios we need to prepare for. We're preparing another surgical ward. We usually have 2. We now have 3. We're preparing ward number 4, staffing it already with internists and people who aren't surgeons, just to care for the possibility of a large number of patients we hope we won't need. Regretfully, what Shabbat taught us, October 7th, another date that will live in infamy in the history of the world, is that we can plan as much as we want and then the unexpected happens. But we're spending this entire week buying equipment, restocking. We just ordered a C-arm for I understand there are medical professionals in the room that will allow additional angiography capabilities in sheltered operating groups, simply because we can currently do 2, but Shabbat taught us we might need to do 3. So we just bought a fairly expensive C-arm with the help of UJ New York, who funded it. It will only arrive in 2 weeks because it needs to be manufactured. But these are the type of scenarios we're preparing for now for the coming ground attack.
Thank you. And for our last question, our other co-chairman of our associate chair of the medical division, Dr. Steve Warren from Tampa, Florida.
Hello, I am an orthopedic surgeon from St. Petersburg, Florida, actually. Dr. Codish, thank you so much for taking the time out of your hectic schedule to share your insight and experience with us today. I know that I speak for the entire Israel Bonds family when I say that we pray for you, your staff, and all of the victims of terrorist atrocities and of war. You touched on this a bit, but at this time, you're inundated with the acute care needs of the injured. But we know that there will be long-term rehabilitation challenges, as you said, both physical and psychological for these patients. How do you prepare your physicians and allied health professionals for such ongoing needs? And how will these enormous resource requirements impact day-to-day facility operations in the future? And as a caveat, you touched on this also, do you think that volunteer physicians and ancillary staff coming from the US and elsewhere could have a significant role, even if they don't speak fluent Hebrew? And how do you incorporate them?
So first of all, let me say our busiest surgeons on Shabbat were orthopedic surgeons. And I'll say one of the things we did, and I think it'll go into textbooks, of emergency preparation, is by noon, we had 100 patients admitted to orthopedics with gunshot wounds to the limbs who weren't operated on because we couldn't afford the resources of an operating theater. So they were sent up to 3 wards to receive painkillers, antibiotics, and every 4 hours, someone looked at them to make sure we didn't miss a gunshot wound elsewhere. So a real hats off to our orthopedic surgeons who were the real front of this. That's sort of not what you asked, but you said you were an orthopedic surgeon. I felt the need to mention this. Moving forward, mental health in Israel has been under a significant shortage for many years. And we're already seeing an enormous, I'm going to use challenge is too light a word, crisis of mental health in the community, of survivors. People didn't make it to didn't come to the hospital, who survived, but saw their parents killed in front of them. We don't really have the response required for those people in the country. And there will definitely be room for better and wider volunteer efforts for these groups. Of course, with mental health, language is a barrier. I mean, we need to have people who can communicate, but there are a lot of foreign nationals living in Israel who speak other languages, and we've already started mapping where we can get help in the community for speakers of other languages, where people from outside of the country can be significant. Rehab, again, a huge issue, because the community needs to rebuild. Their entire community is wiped out. There will be no home physical therapy anytime soon in the Western Negev. This will all become hospital-based. And as people know, rehabilitation has moved from hospital to homes, and we're going to have to move it back. One of the reasons we're now seeking donations, and even before the ground incursion, to build a new rehab unit. Cost about $1.5 million. It needs to be done because 2 weeks out we'll need it, and if we don't start looking for the equipment now, it won't be available then. Again, Israelis are surprisingly good at planning when it comes to emergency situations. We're terrible at it in all routine times, which is why we have a mental health crisis. But we're doing a reasonable job, I think, foreseeing what we might need in coming times. And as I already said, our staff will be a huge issue moving forward.
Thank you again, Dr. Codish, for your time, your insight. I think it was extremely heart-wrenching for all of us that I can say, but I think the insight not only to how you are treating patients as of today, but your insight as to where we're going in the future is very helpful to all of us.